Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I invite you into a realm of domestic terror with 8 of the most disturbing true new house horror stories ever submitted. These are not tales spun from imagination or borrowed from creepypasta forums, but first-hand testimonies from individuals whose dream homes became waking nightmares. What you are about to hear comes directly from those who lived through these experiences. People who discovered that the most terrifying things do not lurk in abandoned buildings or remote locations, but within the very walls meant to shelter us. From hidden rooms concealing dark secrets to neighbors who refuse to let boundaries stand. From unexplainable phenomena that defy logic to discoveries that connect innocent families to unspeakable crimes, each account will take you deeper into the unsettling reality that home is not always a sanctuary. The narratives have been carefully documented to preserve every chilling detail exactly as they occurred, though certain identifying information has been altered to protect those who trusted us with their stories. If you have not yet subscribed to Paranoia Files, now is the moment to join our community of those who seek the truth behind the terror. Click that subscribe button and activate the notification bell so you never miss an episode when darkness finds its way into the ordinary. After you listen, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Share your own new house experiences or tell me which of tonight's 8 stories left you questioning whether you truly know what lies behind your own walls. I bought my first house 3 months ago, and I have already decided I am never doing renovations again. Not because of the cost or the hassle, but because of what I found behind the drywall in my basement. I still own the house. I still live here. But there is a part of this property that I will never enter again, and there is a door that I have paid professionals to seal shut forever. What I found down there changed the way I understand the place I call home, and I do not think I will ever feel completely safe here again. There are nights when I lie awake in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling, and I wonder if those creaks and groans are really just the wood expanding and contracting, or if something else is moving down there in the dark. Let me back up a little bit. I am 32 years old, and up until last year I had been renting apartments my entire adult life. The rent kept climbing every single year, and I was throwing away money on a place that would never truly be mine. Every lease renewal felt like another year of my life slipping away with nothing to show for it. So when I finally scraped together enough for a down payment, I went house hunting with my realtor, a woman named Clara who had been in the business for 20 years. She had this way of talking about properties that made even the worst ones sound promising. But I appreciated her honesty when it mattered. She showed me probably a dozen properties, but most of them were either way out of my price range or in neighborhoods that made me nervous. Then she brought me to this place. It was a fixer-upper, no question about that. The house was built sometime in the early 70s, and it had that very dated look with wood paneling on the walls and orange shag carpet in the living room that had probably been stylish once but now just looked sad and worn. The previous owner had been an elderly man who passed away about 6 months before the house went on the market, and his estate was selling it as is. The price was lower than anything else I had seen. Thousands below market value for the neighborhood, and Clara told me that with some elbow grease and maybe $5,000 or $10,000 in cosmetic updates, I could turn it into something really nice. I walked through it twice, checked the roof, the foundation, the plumbing, and everything seemed solid. The basement was unfinished, just concrete floors and exposed beams, but it was dry and spacious. I figured I could turn it into a home office or maybe a workshop. A place where I could finally have room to spread out and work on projects. I made an offer that same afternoon, and 2 weeks later the house was mine. The first month was all about cleaning and painting. I ripped up that awful orange carpet and refinished the hardwood floors underneath, which turned out to be beautiful oak that had been hidden for decades. I tore down the wood paneling and repainted the walls in something neutral and modern, a soft gray that made the rooms feel bigger and brighter. The place was starting to look really good, and I was proud of what I was accomplishing. Friends who stopped by kept telling me how impressed they were, and I felt like I had made the right decision. Then I turned my attention to the basement. My plan was to drywall the whole thing, add some recessed lighting, and put in a nice desk and some shelving. I had watched enough videos online to feel confident that I could handle the project myself, so I bought the materials and got to work. About a week into the basement project, I noticed something strange. There was a section of wall near the back corner that had severe water damage. The concrete behind the drywall was damp, and there were streaks of rust and mold running down from the ceiling in long, dark lines that looked almost deliberate. I figured there must have been a leak at some point, maybe from an old pipe or from groundwater seeping through the foundation. I grabbed a pry bar and started pulling away the damaged drywall so I could assess how bad the problem was. The drywall came off in big chunks, crumbling in my hands as I worked, releasing clouds of dust that made me cough and cover my face. But as I cleared away more and more of it, I realized that what I was looking at was not just a damaged wall. It was a door. The door was small, maybe 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and it was made of thick wood that had been painted the same color as the concrete around it. If it had not been for the water damage eating away at the drywall, I never would have noticed it. The paint job was meticulous, almost professional, like someone had taken great care to make sure it blended in perfectly. There was no handle, just a smooth surface with a small keyhole near the center. I stood there for a long time, staring at it and trying to figure out what it could possibly be. Maybe it was an old storage closet, or maybe it led to some kind of utility access. But the more I looked at it, the more unsettled I felt. Why would someone go through the trouble of hiding a door behind drywall? And why was it painted to blend in with the wall? What could possibly be behind it that someone wanted hidden so badly? I tried the keyhole first, but I did not have a key, and when I tried to force it with a screwdriver, nothing budged. The door was solid, like it had been built to keep something in or keep something out. I went upstairs and searched through the boxes of junk that the previous owner had left behind, hoping to find a key or maybe some kind of explanation. I found old bills, expired coupons, a few photographs of people I did not recognize, but no key. I even called Clara and asked her if she knew anything about a hidden door in the basement, but she had no idea. She sounded genuinely surprised and told me she had never heard of anything like that. She said the estate sale had included everything in the house, and if there had been a key, it should have been in one of those boxes. I decided to force the door open. I went back down to the basement with a crowbar and a hammer, and I wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. It took a lot of effort, and I was sweating and breathing hard by the time I finally felt the door start to give. The wood groaned and splintered, resisting every inch of the way, and I had to brace my foot against the wall for leverage. There was a loud crack as the wood finally gave way, and then the door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost human, almost like a sigh of relief or resignation. The smell that came out was overwhelming, a thick, musty odor mixed with something sharper, like old paper and decay and something else I could not quite identify. I stepped back and covered my nose with my shirt, waiting for the smell to dissipate before I dared to look inside. The room beyond the door was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a low ceiling that made it feel claustrophobic and oppressive. There was no light, so I had to use the flashlight on my phone to see anything. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the space in harsh white light. The first thing I noticed was the furniture. There was a child-sized crib in one corner, the kind with wooden bars and a faded mattress that had yellowed with age. Next to it was an old rocking chair covered in dust so thick that it looked like it had been sitting there for decades. On the floor were scattered pieces of paper, dozens of them, all yellowed with age and curling at the edges. I stepped inside, moving slowly and carefully, and I picked up one of the pages. My hands were already shaking. It was a journal entry written in shaky handwriting that was barely legible. The ink had faded in some places, but I could still make out most of the words. The entry was dated March 14th, 1989, and it read, "I can feel it getting stronger. The urges are coming back, and I do not know how much longer I can resist. I have locked myself in here to keep them safe. I will not let it win. I will not let it use me again." My hands were shaking even harder as I read it, and I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. I picked up another page and then another, and each one was more disturbing than the last. The entries spanned several months, and they detailed the writer's slow descent into something horrible. He talked about voices that told him to hurt people, about visions that kept him awake at night, and about a growing compulsion to do things that he described as unthinkable. He wrote about locking himself in the room, about how the walls were supposed to keep him contained, about how he hoped that if he stayed there long enough, the urges would go away. But they did not go away. The entries became more frantic as the weeks went on, the handwriting more erratic, the sentences shorter and more desperate. He wrote about scratching at the walls until his fingers bled, about screaming until his voice gave out, about praying for death because it seemed like the only escape. The final entry was dated July 2nd, 1989, and it was only one sentence long. "I cannot fight it anymore. God forgive me." I dropped the page and backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest so hard that I thought it might burst. I pulled out my phone and searched for the address of the house, cross-referencing it with public records and old news articles. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. The previous owner, the elderly man whose estate had sold me the house, was named Howard. But before Howard, the house had belonged to a man named Earl, and Earl had died in 1989. The obituary said that he had taken his own life, and that he was survived by his wife and 2 young children. There was no mention of what had driven him to it, no mention of the hidden room or the journal entries I had just read. The obituary was short and clinical, just a few lines about his life and his survivors, nothing about the darkness he had been fighting. I called the police, and they sent 2 officers to the house to take a look. They went down into the basement, read through some of the journal entries, and took photographs of the room. One of them told me that it was not uncommon for people with severe mental illness to isolate themselves, and that Earl had probably been struggling with something that he could not control. They said there was nothing illegal about the room, nothing that warranted further investigation. They told me I could do whatever I wanted with it, and then they left. Their indifference bothered me more than I expected. To them, it was just another sad story, another casualty of mental illness. But to me, it was the foundation of my home, a secret that had been buried and waiting for someone to uncover it. I hired a contractor to seal the door shut. I did not want to destroy the room or remove the furniture or the journal entries because some part of me felt like that would be disrespectful. But I also could not leave it open. I could not walk past that door every day knowing what was on the other side. The contractor was a man in his 50s who did not ask many questions, which I appreciated. He built a false wall over the door, drywalled it, and painted it to match the rest of the basement. You would never know it was there now, and I have not told anyone about it except for a few close friends. But I know it is there. I know that just a few feet below where I am sitting right now, there is a room where a man locked himself away to fight against something inside his own mind. I know that he lost that fight, and I know that he died in this house. Every creak I hear at night sounds like someone trying to get out. Every shadow in the basement looks like it is moving. I tell myself that it is just my imagination, that there is nothing down there except old furniture and pieces of paper. But I cannot shake the feeling that something is still in that room, something that Earl left behind when he gave up. I do not believe in ghosts, and I do not believe in curses, but I cannot explain the sense of dread that washes over me every time I go down to the basement. I cannot explain why I sometimes hear faint scratching sounds coming from behind that false wall, or why my dog refuses to go down there anymore. She used to follow me everywhere, but now she stops at the top of the basement stairs and whines until I come back up. I still live in this house, and I still love most of it. The renovations turned out great, and the place feels like home in almost every way. But there is a part of this property that I will never enter again, and there is a door that will remain sealed for as long as I own this place. I do not know what Earl was fighting against, and I do not know if he ever hurt anyone before he locked himself away. But I know that he spent his final months in that room alone and afraid, and I know that the darkness he was battling did not die with him. It is still here, waiting behind that wall, and I can feel it every single day. Sometimes I wonder if I should have destroyed the room, burned the journal entries, torn it all down and filled it with concrete. But it is too late now. The room is sealed, and whatever is in there is staying in there. I just hope that wall holds. After my divorce was finalized, I moved to a quiet suburb 2 hours away from anyone who knew me. I wanted anonymity, I wanted to disappear, and for 3 wonderful weeks I thought I had. Then I found the photographs. What started as a fresh beginning turned into the most terrifying experience of my life, and it taught me that sometimes the thing you are running from is not nearly as dangerous as the thing that is already waiting for you when you arrive. My marriage ended badly. I am not going to get into all the details, but it was one of those situations where staying together would have destroyed both of us. The divorce took nearly a year to finalize, and by the time it was over, I was exhausted. I had been living with my sister during the proceedings, sleeping on her couch and trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy, but I knew I needed my own space. I needed a place where I could start over. Somewhere far enough away that I would not run into my ex-husband at the grocery store or see mutual friends who felt obligated to pick sides. So I started looking at houses in towns I had never visited, places where nobody knew my name or my history. I found the house online, listed by a local realtor in a town called Millbrook. It was a small 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of a wooded lot, with white siding and blue shutters and a front porch that looked like something out of a magazine. The price was reasonable, and the listing said it had been recently updated. I scheduled a viewing, drove out there on a Saturday morning, and fell in love with it immediately. The realtor, a friendly older man, told me the previous owner had relocated for work and was motivated to sell quickly. I made an offer that afternoon, and 3 weeks later I was moving in. The first few weeks were blissful. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to arrange furniture and hang pictures and make the place feel like mine. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, and I rarely saw anyone outside except for the occasional dog walker or jogger. My nearest neighbor was about 100 yards away through the trees, and I liked the privacy. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in months. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. I felt safe, I felt free. And then I found the envelope. It was in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a credit card offer. There was no postage, no return address, just my first name written on the front in block letters. I opened it standing there at the end of my driveway, and when I saw what was inside, my hands went cold. There were 3 photographs printed on regular printer paper, and they were all of me. The first one showed me carrying boxes into the house on moving day. The second showed me sitting on my couch reading a book. The third showed me standing in my kitchen making coffee, All of them had been taken from outside through my windows. I stood there for a long time, staring at those photographs and trying to make sense of them. My first thought was that it had to be my ex-husband. He had been angry about the divorce, and there had been moments during the proceedings when I genuinely worried about what he might do. But he lived 2 hours away and I had not told him where I was moving. I had been careful about that. My second thought was that maybe it was some kind of prank, maybe neighborhood kids trying to scare the new resident. But the photographs were too deliberate, too focused. Someone had been watching me and they had wanted me to know it. I called the police. 2 officers came to the house, looked at the photographs, and walked around the property checking for signs of forced entry or footprints or anything that might tell us who had been out there. They found nothing. One of them suggested that I install a security system, and the other one asked if I had any enemies or anyone who might want to harass me. I told them about my ex-husband, and they said they would look into it, but they did not seem particularly concerned. They told me to call if anything else happened, and then they left. Nothing happened for a week. I installed cameras at the front and back doors, changed all the locks, and started keeping the curtains closed even during the day. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump, and I found myself checking the cameras obsessively, scrolling through hours of footage looking for anything unusual. But there was nothing. Just empty driveways and swaying trees and the occasional passing car. I started to think that maybe the photographs had been a one-time thing, maybe whoever had done it had gotten bored or scared off by the police visit. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Then I found the second envelope. It was in my mailbox exactly 1 week after the first one, and this time there were 4 photographs. One showed me sleeping in my bed, the covers pulled up to my chin and my face turned toward the window. The others showed me in various rooms of the house going about my daily routine, but what made my stomach drop was the angle. These were not taken from outside, these were taken from inside my house. I called the police again, and this time they took it more seriously. They searched the entire house, checked every window and door, looked in the attic and the basement and every closet. They found no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no damaged windows, nothing. One of the officers asked me if I had given anyone a key, and I told him no. I had not even had time to make copies for friends or family. The locks had been changed when I moved in, and I had the only set. They dusted for fingerprints and found nothing useful. They told me to be vigilant, to keep my doors locked, and to call immediately if I saw anything suspicious. But they had no explanation for how someone was getting into my house. The third envelope arrived a week later. This time it contained only 1 photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed me sitting at the police station talking to the officers who had come to investigate. I had been there just 2 days earlier. The note said, "You look happy. I am glad you are settling in." The handwriting was neat and careful, almost childlike, and reading it made my skin crawl. Whoever was doing this had followed me to the police station. They were watching me constantly, and they wanted me to know that there was nowhere I could go to escape them. I did not feel safe in my own home anymore. I started staying at a motel in town, only going back to the house during the day to grab clothes or check on things. But even that did not feel safe, because I knew they were still watching. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Alice, who specialized in stalking cases. She installed additional cameras throughout the house, including hidden ones in places that would not be obvious to an intruder. We set them to record continuously, uploading the footage to a cloud server so that even if someone found and destroyed the cameras, we would still have the recordings. It took 3 days for the cameras to catch something. I was at the motel when Alice called me, her voice tense and urgent. She told me to come to her office immediately, and when I got there, she showed me the footage. It was from one of the hidden cameras in the living room, and it showed a man emerging from behind the couch at 2 in the morning. He was thin and pale, maybe in his 30s, wearing dirty clothes and moving with an odd, jerky gait. He walked around the house for nearly an hour, touching things, looking through my belongings, standing in my bedroom doorway and watching the empty bed. Then, just before dawn, he disappeared behind a bookshelf in the hallway. Alice and I watched the footage again and again, trying to figure out where he had gone. The bookshelf was built into the wall, and there was no obvious door or passage behind it. But the man had definitely gone behind it and had not come back out. Alice called the police, and this time they brought in a specialized unit. They pulled the bookshelf away from the wall and found a small access panel, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, hidden behind it. The panel led to a crawl space that ran along the exterior wall of the house, a narrow passage that connected to the basement and the attic. It was a space I had not even known existed, a space that had not shown up on any of the inspection reports. The police went into the crawl space and found him. His name was Ralph, and he was the adult son of the previous owner. According to the police, Ralph had lived in the house with his father for years, but he had severe mental health issues and rarely left the property. When his father decided to sell the house and relocate, Ralph had refused to go. He had hidden in the crawl space, living in the walls, and his father had either not known or had chosen not to tell anyone. Ralph had been living in my house the entire time, coming out at night to move through the rooms, to watch me sleep, to take photographs. He had been there when I moved in, and he had never left. They arrested him, and he was charged with trespassing, stalking, and a handful of other crimes. During questioning, he kept saying the same thing over and over. I was just making sure she was safe. I was just making sure she was okay. The police told me he was not dangerous in a violent sense, that he had never shown any signs of wanting to hurt anyone. But that did not make it better. The thought of him watching me, living in my walls, breathing the same air, it made me sick. I could not stay in that house. I could not even go back to pack my things. I hired people to do it for me, and I put the house on the market immediately. I moved again to a different town even farther away. This time I rented an apartment in a building with security and other tenants and walls that I know are solid. But I do not feel safe. I check every closet, every cabinet, every space large enough for a person to hide. I knock on walls to make sure they are not hollow. I listen for sounds that do not belong. I have cameras everywhere, and I review the footage every single day. I know that Ralph is in custody, that he cannot get to me, but it does not matter. The damage is done. I will never trust a space to be truly private again. I will never feel safe in a house, especially not one that I do not know inside and out. And I will never stop wondering if there is someone else out there, watching from a place I cannot see, waiting for me to let my guard down. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in spirits or demons or anything supernatural. But I cannot explain what happened in my house during the first month I lived there, and I have stopped trying. I am a software engineer, someone who deals in logic and code and problems that have solutions. I approach the world through patterns and data, and I have always prided myself on being rational. But what I experienced in that house defied every rational explanation I could come up with, and even now, months later, I still do not know what to make of it. I bought the house last spring. It was a 1920s craftsman in an older neighborhood, the kind of place with original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves and those thick plaster walls that you do not find in modern construction. I had been looking for something with character, something that felt substantial and permanent. And this house checked all the boxes. The inspection came back clean, the price was fair, and the previous owners were a retired couple who had maintained it beautifully. They were moving to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren, and they seemed almost sad to be leaving. I closed on the house in early April and moved in the following week. The first night was unremarkable. I spent most of it unpacking boxes and setting up my bedroom, and I fell asleep around midnight feeling exhausted but satisfied. I woke up at 2:47 in the morning to the sound of footsteps. They were coming from downstairs, slow and deliberate, and they sounded like someone walking across the hardwood floor in the living room. My first thought was that someone had broken in, and I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police. But then the footsteps started moving toward the stairs, and I heard them begin to ascend. Each step creaked under the weight, a sound that was distinct and unmistakable. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door, and the footsteps stopped immediately. I stood there in the dark hallway listening, but there was nothing. I turned on every light in the house and checked every room, every closet, every window and door. Everything was locked. There was no one there. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses make noise and that I was not used to the sounds yet. I went back to bed, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next night, the same thing happened. I woke up at 2:47 to the sound of footsteps downstairs, and again they moved toward the stairs and began to ascend. This time I stayed in bed and listened, trying to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. The footsteps climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, and then they stopped at the top. I waited for something else to happen, for a door to open or for the sound to move down the hallway, but there was nothing. Just silence. I got up and checked again, and again there was no one there. By the third night, I was determined to figure out what was causing the sound. I set up my phone to record audio, placed it at the top of the stairs, and went to bed. Sure enough, at 2:47, the footsteps began. I listened from my bedroom as they climbed the stairs, and when I checked the recording the next morning, it had captured everything. The sound was clear and distinct, unmistakably footsteps, and there was no other explanation for it on the recording. No creaking pipes, no wind, no ambient noise that could have been mistaken for footsteps. Just the sound of someone walking up the stairs. I started researching the phenomenon online, reading about old houses and the kinds of noises they can make. I learned about thermal expansion, about how temperature changes can cause wood to creak and groan, about how wind can create strange sounds in ductwork and vents. But none of it explained the regularity of what I was hearing. The footsteps happened every single night at exactly 2:47, and they always followed the same pattern. Downstairs, across the living room, up the stairs, stop at the top. It was too consistent to be random, too precise to be explained by settling or expansion. I decided to set up cameras. I bought 2 wireless security cameras and placed them in the living room and at the top of the stairs, angled to capture anyone or anything that might be moving through those spaces. I synced them to my phone so I could watch the live feed, and I went to bed that night feeling like I was finally going to get some answers. At 2:47, I heard the footsteps begin. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, watching the feed from the living room camera. There was nothing there. The room was empty, the shadows were still, and nothing was moving. But I could hear the footsteps, clear as day, moving across that exact space. I switched to the camera at the top of the stairs and watched as the footsteps climbed. I could hear them on the audio feed, each step distinct and heavy, but the video showed nothing. Just an empty staircase lit by the glow of the nightlight I had plugged in at the landing. The footsteps reached the top and then they stopped. I sat there in bed staring at my phone, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I was seeing. It did not make sense. There was no way for sound to exist without a source, no way for footsteps to be audible without something making them. I did not sleep much after that. I spent the next day researching the history of the house, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. I checked property records, old newspaper archives, obituaries, anything that might give me a clue. The house had been built in 1923 by a doctor and his wife, and it had passed through several owners over the decades. There were no records of any deaths in the house, no tragic accidents or murders, nothing that would suggest a haunting in the traditional sense. The previous owners, the retired couple, had lived there for 30 years and had never mentioned anything unusual. By the end of the first week, the footsteps had become part of my routine. I would wake up at 2:47, listen to them climb the stairs, and then lie awake for another hour or two trying to make sense of it. But then something changed. On the 8th night, the footsteps did not stop at the top of the stairs. They continued down the hallway, slow and deliberate, and they stopped outside my bedroom door. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap between the door and the floor, blocking the light from the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and I stared at that shadow for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly the shadow moved away and the footsteps retreated back down the hallway and down the stairs. The next night, the footsteps came all the way to my door again, and this time they did not leave. I could hear breathing on the other side, slow and steady, and I could see the shadow of feet beneath the door. I called out asking who was there, but there was no response. I got out of bed and opened the door as quickly as I could, hoping to catch whoever or whatever it was, but the hallway was empty. The breathing stopped the moment I opened the door, and there was nothing there. I moved a chair in front of my bedroom door that night, and I barely slept. The footsteps came again at 2:47, and again they stopped outside my door, but they did not try to come in. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had deadbolts installed on every door in the house, including my bedroom door. It was irrational, I knew that, because locks do not stop ghosts, but it made me feel better. That night, I locked my bedroom door and waited. The footsteps came, stopped outside my door, and then the doorknob started to turn. Slowly, deliberately, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. It rattled against the deadbolt, and then it stopped. The footsteps retreated. I could not live like that. I started researching paranormal investigators, skeptics, anyone who might be able to help me figure out what was happening. But every time I thought about calling someone, I felt ridiculous. I am a rational person, a logical person, and the idea of calling a ghost hunter felt absurd. So instead, I started looking into the physical structure of the house. I hired a contractor to inspect the basement, the foundation, the walls, anything that might explain the sounds. He found nothing. The house was solid, well built, and there was no structural reason for the sounds I was hearing. Then, on the 15th night, I decided to follow the footsteps. I waited until I heard them begin, and then I got out of bed and walked downstairs as quietly as I could. The footsteps were ahead of me, moving through the living room toward the back of the house. I followed them to the basement door, and I heard them descending the stairs. I turned on the light and went down after them, and the sound led me to the far corner of the basement, to a section of the floor that looked slightly different from the rest. The concrete was a different color, like it had been poured at a different time. And there was a faint rectangular outline, maybe 3 feet by 6 feet. I stood there staring at that section of floor, and the footsteps stopped. The basement was silent. I went back upstairs and called the police, and I told them I thought there might be something buried in my basement. They sent 2 officers, and they brought a ground-penetrating radar unit to scan the floor. The scan showed an anomaly, a void beneath the concrete in that exact spot. They got a warrant, brought in a crew, and excavated the area. They broke through the concrete and dug down about 4 feet, and they found nothing. No body, no remains, no evidence of anything being buried there. Just empty earth. But here is the thing. After they excavated that spot, the footsteps stopped. That night, 247 came and went, and there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no doorknob turning. The house was silent. It has been silent ever since. I still live here, and I have not heard the footsteps again in over 4 months. The police closed their investigation, chalking it up to a false alarm, and the contractor filled in the hole and re-poured the concrete. Everything went back to normal, or as normal as it can be. But I cannot stop thinking about it. Something was buried there, or something wanted us to dig there, and whatever it was got what it wanted. The footsteps stopped the moment we broke through that concrete, like whatever was making them had been trying to get our attention, trying to lead us to that spot. I do not know what we were supposed to find, and I do not know why there was nothing there. Maybe we dug in the wrong place. Maybe whatever was there had been moved a long time ago. Or maybe, and this is the part that keeps me awake at night, maybe the act of digging was enough. Maybe whatever was making those sounds just needed someone to acknowledge that something had happened there, that something had been buried and forgotten. I still do not believe in ghosts. I cannot reconcile what I experienced with what I know about the world. But I also cannot explain it. I cannot explain the footsteps, the breathing, the doorknob turning. I cannot explain why it all stopped the moment we dug up that floor. And I cannot shake the feeling that I am living in a house where something terrible happened. Something that left a mark so deep that it bled through into the present. I do not know what it was, and I am not sure I want to know. All I know is that the house is quiet now, and I intend to keep it that way. I am writing this from a hospital, and the doctors keep asking me if I understand why I am here. I tell them I do, but what I cannot tell them is whether what I experienced was real. I am 46 years old, and I have spent the last 20 years building a successful career in corporate finance. I have always been someone who thrives under pressure, someone who makes decisions quickly and confidently. But something happened to me in the house I bought 3 months ago, and I am no longer sure which thoughts were mine and which ones came from somewhere else. Let me start from the beginning. I was promoted to senior vice president last fall, a position I had been working toward for years. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, and I decided to celebrate by buying a house that reflected my success. I had been living in a modest apartment downtown close to the office, but I wanted something bigger, something impressive. I found a property in an upscale neighborhood, a modern 5-bedroom house with floor-to-ceiling windows and a home theater and all the amenities I could want. The price was steep, but I could afford it, and I closed on the house in early November. The house was beautiful, exactly what I had envisioned for myself. I moved in with minimal furniture, planning to decorate slowly and deliberately. I was working long hours at the office, often coming home after dark, and I spent most of my time in the master bedroom and the home office I had set up on the 2nd floor. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and I found myself appreciating the solitude after years of living in a noisy apartment building. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I started hearing the voice. It came through the air vents, faint and barely audible at first, like someone speaking in another room. I assumed it was coming from a neighbor's house, that somehow sound was traveling through the ventilation system. The voice was male, calm and measured, and it seemed to be giving advice or instructions about something. I could not make out the words clearly, so I ignored it. But over the next few days, the voice became clearer, and I realized it was talking about my work. The voice knew details about my job, about projects I was managing and people I was working with. It would offer suggestions like, "The Henderson account needs more attention," or "Do not trust the numbers from the regional office." At first, I thought I was overhearing someone on a conference call, that maybe the previous owner had left a smart speaker connected to someone else's system. I searched the house for hidden devices, checked every vent and every speaker, but I found nothing. The voice continued, always at night, always when I was alone in the house. I started following the advice. The voice told me to review the Henderson account more carefully, and when I did, I found discrepancies that could have cost the company millions. The voice told me to double-check the regional numbers, and I discovered that someone had been manipulating the data. My superiors were impressed with my diligence, and my reputation at the company grew. I began to rely on the voice, listening for it every night, waiting for guidance. It felt like I had an invisible advisor, someone who understood my work better than I did. But then the voice started changing. It began offering advice about my colleagues, suggesting that they were working against me, that they resented my success. It told me that my assistant was spreading rumors about me, that my closest colleague was trying to undermine my projects. I did not want to believe it, but the voice was so specific, so confident, that I started to doubt the people around me. I became suspicious, watching for signs of betrayal, interpreting every interaction as confirmation of what the voice was telling me. The voice told me that a co-worker named Lois was planning to sabotage a major presentation I was giving to the board. It said she had been meeting with my competitors, feeding them inside information, and that she would do everything she could to make me fail. I confronted her in the office, accused her in front of other colleagues, and demanded to know what she was planning. She looked at me like I was insane, told me she had no idea what I was talking about, and reported me to human resources. I was reprimanded, told to take a few days off to rest, but I knew I was right. The voice had warned me, and I had acted on it. I went back to the house and listened for the voice, desperate for reassurance. It came through the vents that night, stronger than ever, and it told me I had done the right thing. It said that Lois was dangerous, that she was still plotting against me, and that I needed to protect myself. It told me to gather evidence, to go through her files, to find proof of her betrayal. I spent the next 2 days obsessing over it, barely sleeping, convinced that I was uncovering a conspiracy. But there was no evidence. There was nothing to find. The voice started giving me instructions that made no sense. It told me to stop going to the office, that it was not safe, that people were watching me. It told me to disconnect my phone, to avoid answering the door, to stay in the house where I would be protected. I followed the instructions because by that point I could not imagine not following them. The voice had become the only thing I trusted, the only constant in a world that felt increasingly hostile and confusing. Then the voice told me to hurt someone. It said that a colleague named Carl was the mastermind behind everything, that he had been orchestrating the campaign against me, and that the only way to stop him was to confront him physically. It described exactly what I needed to do, how I needed to wait for him in the parking garage after work, how I needed to make sure he understood that I would not be pushed around. The voice was insistent, repeating the instructions over and over, and I found myself agreeing. It made sense. Carl had always been competitive with me, and the voice was right to identify him as a threat. I went to the office the next day, parked in the garage, and waited. When Carl walked to his car, I approached him. I do not remember everything that happened next, but I remember shouting at him, grabbing him, and pushing him against his car. I remember him trying to get away, and I remember security guards pulling me off of him. I remember being escorted out of the building, Carl pressing charges, and the police being called. I remember sitting in the back of a police car, confused and disoriented, unable to explain why I had done what I did. The police took me to the hospital instead of jail because I was incoherent, talking about the voice and the conspiracy and how I was just trying to protect myself. The doctors sedated me, and when I woke up, I was in a psychiatric ward. They ran tests, conducted evaluations, and eventually told me that I had experienced a psychotic break. They said it was likely triggered by stress and isolation, that the pressure of my new position and the solitude of living alone in a large house had created the perfect conditions for a mental health crisis. They told me there was no voice, no conspiracy, no one plotting against me. It was all in my head. They brought in specialists to examine the house, to check the ventilation system and look for any possible source of the voice I had been hearing. They found nothing. The vents were standard, the air system was functioning normally, and there was no way for sound to travel from neighboring properties. One of the doctors explained that auditory hallucinations are common in psychotic episodes, that the brain can create voices that sound completely real, and that those voices often reflect the anxieties and fears of the person experiencing them. He said that my voice had been constructed from my own thoughts, my own paranoia, and that it had told me what I was already afraid of. I have been in the hospital for 6 weeks now, and I am on medication that is supposed to help me distinguish between reality and delusion. The voice is gone, and I have not heard it since the night I was admitted. My doctors say that is a good sign, that the medication is working and that with therapy and time I should be able to return to a normal life. But I do not feel normal. I feel like I have lost something fundamental, like I can no longer trust my own mind. The house has been sold. My sister handled the sale while I was in the hospital, and I will never set foot in it again. My job is gone, terminated after the incident with Carl, and I am facing legal consequences for what I did to him. Carl has agreed not to press criminal charges if I continue with treatment and stay away from him, and I have accepted those terms. My career is over. My reputation is destroyed, and I am living in a halfway house while I try to piece my life back together. But here is what I cannot stop thinking about. The voice knew things I did not know. It warned me about the Henderson account before I had any reason to suspect a problem, and it was right. It told me to check the regional numbers, and I found evidence of manipulation that I had no way of knowing about. How could a hallucination give me accurate information? How could my own mind create a voice that predicted things I had not yet discovered? The doctors say it is confirmation bias, that I probably had subconscious suspicions about those issues and the voice simply brought them to my conscious awareness. They say that the human mind is capable of processing information without us realizing it, and that what I experienced was my brain trying to help me solve problems in a very dysfunctional way. But I do not know if I believe that. I do not know if I can accept that everything the voice told me was just a product of my own anxiety and stress. I have asked myself 1,000 times whether the voice was real, and I still do not have an answer. I know what the doctors say, and I know what the evidence suggests. But there is a part of me that wonders if something else was happening in that house. I wonder if the isolation and the pressure created an opening for something to get inside my head. Something that used my fears and my ambitions to manipulate me. I wonder if I was experiencing a mental breakdown, or if I was being influenced by something I cannot explain. I am not asking anyone to believe me. I am not even sure I believe myself. But I know that I spent 3 months in that house, and by the end of it, I was a different person. I had become paranoid, violent, and detached from reality, and I hurt someone because of it. Whether the voice was real or not, the damage it caused was real. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand what happened to me, trying to figure out where my thoughts ended and the voice began. I do not think I will ever know for sure, and that uncertainty, that not knowing, is the worst part of all. I cannot trust myself anymore, and I cannot trust my own perceptions. Every thought I have, every decision I make, I question whether it is really mine or whether it is something else whispering through the vents of my mind. I am told that with time and treatment I will regain my confidence and my sense of self. But right now I am just trying to make it through each day, hoping that the voice never comes back, and terrified of what it might mean if it does. My grandmother left me her house when she passed, and I moved in without hesitation. I had spent every summer there as a child, running through the backyard, baking cookies in her kitchen, falling asleep on her couch while she watched her evening programs. I thought I knew every corner of that property. I was wrong. What I found in her belongings changed everything I thought I knew about her, about my family, and about the life she had lived in that house for more than 50 years. My grandmother's name was Alice, and she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89. She had been a quiet woman, polite and reserved, the kind of person who kept to herself and rarely shared details about her past. In her later years, she had become even more reclusive, rarely leaving the house except for doctor's appointments and grocery shopping. My mother used to worry about her living alone, but my grandmother insisted she was fine, that she liked her privacy and her routines. When she passed, she left the house to me in her will, along with all of its contents. I was the only grandchild who had stayed close to her, visiting regularly even after I became an adult, and I think she appreciated that. I took a leave of absence from my teaching job and moved into the house to sort through her belongings. The place was exactly as I remembered it, filled with old furniture and photographs and the smell of lavender sachets that she had kept in every drawer. I started in the bedrooms, packing clothes for donation and setting aside items that had sentimental value. Then I moved to her study, a small room at the back of the house that she had always kept locked when I was a child. I had asked her about it once, and she had told me it was just storage, nothing interesting. But the way she said it made me feel like I should not ask again. The study was cluttered with filing cabinets, boxes of old papers, and shelves lined with books. I started going through the filing cabinets, expecting to find tax returns and bank statements and the usual paperwork that accumulates over a lifetime. What I found instead was something I could not explain. The first cabinet was filled with newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, all carefully cut out and organized by date. They were articles about missing persons, disappearances that had happened in our state and neighboring states between the 1960s and the 1980s. Each article had been placed in a clear plastic sleeve, and many of them had handwritten notes in the margins. I pulled out a stack and started reading through them. The notes were in my grandmother's handwriting, neat and precise, and they included dates, locations, and cryptic phrases like confirmed and verified and matches the pattern. Some of the articles had been marked with red ink, circling specific details or names. I kept reading, pulling out more and more clippings, and I realized that she had been documenting these cases for years, maybe decades. But why? What possible reason could she have had for collecting articles about missing people? I found maps in the second filing cabinet, detailed topographical maps of the surrounding counties. They had been marked with dozens of small red X's, each one labeled with a date and a set of initials. I spread one of the maps out on the desk and stared at it, trying to make sense of the markings. Some of the locations were in remote areas deep in the woods or near abandoned properties. One of the X's was on my grandmother's property, in the area where she had kept a garden shed. The date next to it was August 12, 1977, and the initials were LM. I felt sick. I did not want to believe what I was looking at, but the evidence was right there in front of me. My grandmother had been tracking something, documenting something, and it involved missing people in marked locations. I picked up the phone and called the police. I told them what I had found, and they sent 2 detectives to the house. They spent hours going through the filing cabinets, photographing the clippings and the maps and the notes. One of them asked me if my grandmother had ever mentioned anything about these cases, and I told him no, never. He said it was probably just an obsessive hobby, that some people become fixated on unsolved mysteries, but he agreed to look into it. The detectives left with boxes of my grandmother's files, and I tried to go back to packing, but I could not focus. I kept thinking about that X on the map, the one on my grandmother's property. I went outside and walked to the area where the garden shed had been. My grandmother had torn it down years ago, saying it was falling apart and not worth repairing, but I remembered playing near it as a child. The ground there was overgrown with weeds now, and there was nothing to indicate what might be beneath it. I called the detectives back and told them about the X on the property. They returned the next day with a ground-penetrating radar unit and a team of forensic investigators. They scanned the area where the shed had been, and the radar detected an anomaly about 4 feet below the surface. They got a warrant to excavate, and they brought in a crew with shovels and equipment. I stood at a distance and watched as they dug, my stomach churning with dread. It took them most of the day, but they found something. Human remains buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in a tarp that had deteriorated over the years. The detectives told me it would take time to identify the remains, but they believed it was connected to one of the missing persons cases in my grandmother's files. They excavated 2 more sites based on the X's marked on her maps, and they found remains at both locations. Within a week, they had reopened multiple cold cases, and my grandmother's files became the key to solving murders that had gone unsolved for decades. The detectives told me that my grandmother had not been the killer. The evidence suggested she had been documenting the crimes, tracking them, and possibly trying to build a case against someone. But she had never come forward, never reported what she knew to the authorities. When I asked them why, one of the detectives told me they had found a journal in the files hidden at the bottom of one of the cabinets. The journal explained everything. My grandmother had known the killer. He was her older brother, my great-uncle, a man named Henry. According to the journal, Henry had been violent and unstable, and my grandmother had suspected him of terrible things since they were young. She had witnessed him hurting animals as a child, and she had seen him become obsessed with control and power as he grew older. In the 1960s, people started disappearing in the area, and my grandmother began to suspect that Henry was responsible. She started collecting evidence, documenting the disappearances, tracking his movements. She marked the locations where she believed he had buried his victims, places he had mentioned or places she had seen him go. But she never went to the police. The journal explained that she was terrified of Henry, that he had threatened her and her family, and that she believed he would kill her if she ever exposed him. So she stayed silent, documenting everything in secret, hoping that someday someone would find her files and bring him to justice. Henry died in 1992, and my grandmother kept collecting evidence even after his death, refining her maps and her notes, making sure that the truth would eventually come out. The police confirmed that the remains matched missing persons from the cases in my grandmother's files, and they were able to connect Henry to the crimes through DNA evidence and other forensic analysis. My grandmother's documentation had been meticulous, and it gave investigators everything they needed to close cases that had haunted families for generations. But for me, the discovery was devastating. My grandmother, the woman I had loved and trusted, had lived with this secret for her entire life. She had known where the bodies were buried, and she had said nothing. I understand why she stayed silent. I understand that she was afraid, that she was protecting herself and her family. But I cannot stop thinking about the families of those victims, the people who spent years searching for answers, wondering what had happened to their loved ones. My grandmother could have given them closure, but she chose silence instead. And now I am left with the knowledge that the house I loved, the place where I spent my happiest childhood memories, was built on a foundation of terrible secrets. I still live in the house. I did not have the heart to sell it, and part of me feels like I owe it to my grandmother to keep it, to honor her memory, even though I do not fully understand the choices she made. But the house feels different now. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture, every corner of the property carries the weight of what I know. I look at pictures of my grandmother and wonder what she was thinking, what she was carrying inside her all those years. I wonder if she ever felt relief, or if the guilt and fear consumed her until the day she died. The garden area where the shed used to be is empty now, just a patch of dirt where nothing grows. I have thought about planting flowers there, about turning it into something beautiful, but I cannot bring myself to do it. It feels wrong, like I would be covering up the truth all over again. So I leave it empty, a reminder of what was buried there and what my grandmother knew. I do not know if I will ever make peace with what I found, but I know that I cannot forget it. The house is mine now, and so are its secrets, and I will carry them for the rest of my life. Carl and I thought we had found the perfect starter home. Great neighborhood, friendly people, beautiful tree-lined street. Then we met Earl, the man next door, and everything changed. What began as neighborly helpfulness turned into something sinister, and we learned that sometimes the most dangerous threats do not come from strangers in the night, but from the person living just a few feet away. We bought the house last spring after months of searching. Carl and I had been married for 2 years, and we were ready to stop renting and invest in our own place. The house was a small 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet suburb, exactly what we could afford on our combined salaries. The neighborhood looked perfect when we first drove through it. The lawns were well maintained, the houses were charming, and everyone we passed seemed to wave or smile. It felt safe. It felt like the kind of place where we could build a life. We closed on the house in April and spent the first week painting and moving our furniture in. On the 3rd day, our neighbor from the house on the right side came over to introduce himself. His name was Earl, and he was probably in his early 60s, a retired postal worker who lived alone. He seemed friendly enough, offering to help us with anything we needed and telling us about the neighborhood. He brought over a plate of cookies that his sister had made, and he stayed on our front porch for nearly an hour talking about the history of the street and the people who lived there. Over the next few weeks, Earl became a constant presence. He would show up unannounced with tools we had not asked to borrow, offering to help with projects around the house. At first, Carl and I appreciated it. We were new to home ownership, and Earl had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He knew which contractors were reliable, where to get the best deals on supplies, and how to fix things that we had no idea how to handle. But then his visits became more frequent and more intrusive. Earl started letting himself into our house. We would come home from work and find him in our kitchen putting away groceries he claimed he had picked up for us, or in our yard, mowing the lawn without being asked. When I mentioned that he should probably knock before coming in, he laughed and said that the previous owners had given him a spare key in case of emergencies, and that he still had it. He said it was normal for neighbors to look after each other and that we should not worry about it. Carl asked him to return the key, and Earl seemed offended, but he handed it over. We thought that would be the end of it, but Earl continued to show up. He would knock on the door early in the morning asking if we needed anything from the store. He would appear in the evenings while we were having dinner, standing on the porch and peering through the windows. When Carl confronted him and asked him to give us some space, Earl became cold and distant. He stopped waving when we passed him outside, and he stopped making eye contact. The friendly neighbor had disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed resentful and angry. A few days after Carl asked Earl to respect our privacy, things started happening. Our trash cans were knocked over in the middle of the night, garbage scattered across the driveway. We assumed it was animals at first, but then we found a dead bird on our front porch, placed carefully on the welcome mat. Carl checked the security camera we had installed at the front door, but the footage showed nothing unusual. Then our car tires were slashed, all 4 of them, while the car was parked in our driveway. We called the police, and they took a report, but they said there was no evidence pointing to anyone specific. I knew it was Earl. The timing was too convenient, and the way he watched us from his porch made it clear that he was angry. But when the police questioned him, he denied everything. He said he had been home all night and had not seen or heard anything unusual. The officers told us it was probably just random vandalism, and that we should install more cameras and keep an eye out. But I knew better. Earl was sending us a message. Carl and I started documenting everything. We installed cameras at every entrance to the house, and we kept a log of every time Earl showed up or did something suspicious. The harassment continued. Our mailbox was knocked over, our garden hose was cut. Strange noises would wake us up in the middle of the night, and when we looked outside, we would see Earl standing in his driveway watching our house. We reported it to the police again, and they said they would increase patrols in the area, but nothing changed. One night, around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in our bedroom. I opened my eyes and saw Earl standing at the foot of our bed, just staring at us. I screamed, and Carl jumped up and turned on the light. Earl did not run or try to hide. He just stood there, calm and composed, and said he had heard a noise outside and thought someone was trying to break in. He said he had let himself in to check on us, to make sure we were safe. Carl grabbed his phone and called the police while I demanded to know how Earl had gotten inside. He said he had kept a copy of the key we had asked him to return, that he knew we would need his help eventually. The police arrested Earl that night for trespassing, and we got a restraining order against him. But the legal process was slow and frustrating. Earl hired a lawyer and fought the charges, claiming he had been acting out of concern for our safety. The judge reduced the charges to a misdemeanor, and Earl was released with a fine and a warning to stay away from our property. The restraining order was supposed to keep him at least 100 yards away, but he lived right next door. We could see his house from our windows, and he could see ours. After Earl was released, we found a letter in our mailbox. It was from the previous owners of our house, the people who had sold it to us. The letter had been left in the attic, tucked inside a box of old Christmas decorations, and we had not found it until we were looking for something else. The letter was addressed to whoever bought the house, and it warned us about Earl. It explained that Earl had a pattern of befriending new neighbors, ingratiating himself into their lives, and then turning hostile when they set boundaries. The previous owners said they had dealt with harassment for over a year before finally deciding to move. They said the police were aware of Earl but had not been able to do anything substantial because Earl was careful not to leave evidence. The letter also mentioned that several families before them had experienced the same thing, and that Earl had a reputation in the neighborhood for driving people out. Once they left, Earl would watch the house sit empty for a while, and then new people would move in, and the cycle would start over. The previous owners had tried to warn others, but no one had taken it seriously until it was too late. They apologized for not telling us sooner, but they said they were afraid that if they disclosed the issue, we would not have bought the house, and they needed to sell it quickly. Carl and I realized we were trapped. We had used all of our savings for the down payment and closing costs, and we could not afford to move. We could not afford to sell the house at a loss, and we knew that if we disclosed the situation with Earl to potential buyers, no one would want it. So we stayed, and we have been living in this standoff for 6 months now. Earl has not violated the restraining order, at least not in any way we can prove, but he is always there, always watching. He stands on his porch when we leave for work. He sits in his driveway when we come home. He mows his lawn at odd hours, making sure we can hear the noise. He has visitors who park in front of our house instead of his, blocking our driveway. When we complain, the visitors move, but they come back the next day. Earl has also started filing complaints against us. He claims our dog barks too much, that our trash cans are left out too long, that our car is parked too close to the property line. Every complaint is investigated by the Homeowners Association, and even though none of them have been substantiated, it creates a constant stream of stress and bureaucracy. Earl knows exactly how to work the system, how to make our lives difficult without breaking any laws. Carl and I have talked about fighting back, about taking legal action, about finding a way to force Earl to leave us alone. But every lawyer we have consulted has told us the same thing. Earl is not doing anything illegal enough to warrant serious consequences, and a civil lawsuit would be expensive and difficult to win. The restraining order is the best we can do, and even that feels meaningless when he lives 20 feet away. So we live here, in the house we thought would be our dream home, and we endure. Every day is a battle of wills, a test of how much we can tolerate. We have security cameras, deadbolts on every door, and a plan for what to do if Earl ever crosses the line again. But we also know that he is patient, that he has been doing this for years, and that he has outlasted every family that has tried to stand up to him. We are just the latest in a long line of people who thought they could make it work, who thought they could outlast him. I do not know how long we can keep this up. The stress is affecting our marriage, our jobs, our health. We barely sleep, and when we do, we wake up to every sound, every creak, wondering if Earl has found a way inside. We have thought about moving, about walking away from the house and taking the financial hit, but part of me refuses to give him that satisfaction. Part of me wants to stay, to prove that we will not be driven out like the others. But I am not sure we can win. Earl has time, resources, and decades of experience, and every day we stay here, every day we fight this battle, I feel a little more of myself slipping away. This house was supposed to be our future, but instead it has become a prison, and Earl is the warden. And I do not know if we will ever escape. 6 months after my wife Frances passed, I sold our family home and bought a small ranch house across town. I needed a fresh start, but the previous owner left something behind that has made moving on impossible. What I found in that house connected to my own life in a way that I cannot explain, and it has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the woman I loved. Frances died suddenly last winter. She had been complaining of headaches for a few weeks, and then one morning she collapsed in the kitchen. The doctors said it was a brain aneurysm, that there was nothing anyone could have done. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. We had been married for 37 years, and I had never imagined a life without her. The house we had raised our children in felt too big and too empty after she died, filled with memories that made it impossible to move forward. So I put it on the market, and when it sold, I started looking for something smaller. I found the ranch house through an estate sale listing. The previous owner had died, and his widow had already moved out of state to live with her daughter. She was selling the house furnished, and the price included most of the contents. I walked through it once, liked the layout, and made an offer. The sale went through quickly, and I moved in with just my clothes and a few personal items. Everything else I needed was already there. I spent the first few weeks settling in, going through the furniture and belongings that came with the house. Most of it was generic, nothing personal or distinctive. But then I found the shoebox. It was tucked into a built-in shelf unit in the hallway, pushed to the back behind some old books. The box was made of plain brown cardboard, and it was filled with cassette tapes. There were maybe 20 of them, each one labeled with a date written in black marker. The dates ranged from January 1990 to November 1992. I had not seen a cassette tape in years, but I still had an old tape player in a box somewhere from when I was cleaning out the family home. I dug it out, plugged it in, and loaded the first tape. There was a moment of static, and then a man's voice came through, clear and steady. He was recording a diary entry, talking about his day, mundane details about work and errands and what he had eaten for dinner. He mentioned his wife several times, always with affection, calling her his partner and his best friend. It was boring, the kind of thing anyone might record if they wanted to document their life, and I almost turned it off. But something made me keep listening. I loaded the second tape, and then the third, following the progression of dates. The man continued to document his daily life, but over the weeks and months his tone began to change. He started mentioning physical symptoms, headaches and fatigue and stomach pain. He said he had been to the doctor, but they could not find anything wrong. He said his wife was worried about him, that she kept insisting he get more tests, but he felt like he was wasting everyone's time. By the fifth tape, the man's voice had taken on a darker quality. He said he was convinced something was wrong, that the symptoms were getting worse, and that he suspected his wife was somehow responsible. He did not say it outright at first, just hints and vague suspicions, but as the tapes progressed, his paranoia became explicit. He said he thought she was poisoning him. He said he had started testing his food, watching what she prepared, and that he was certain she was adding something to his meals. I sat there in my living room listening to this man spiral into fear and suspicion, and I felt sick. He sounded so convinced, so certain that his wife was trying to kill him. But he also sounded desperate and confused, and I could not tell if he was experiencing something real or if he was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. The tapes continued and his condition worsened. He described intense pain, nights where he could not sleep, and moments where he felt like he was losing his mind. He said he had installed hidden cameras in the house, that he was gathering evidence, and that he would take everything to the police when he had enough proof. The final tape was dated November 14, 1992. The man's voice was weak and strained, and he spoke in a whisper like he was afraid of being overheard. He said he had the proof he needed, that he had captured footage of his wife adding something to his food, and that he was going to the police the next morning. He said he could not believe she would do this to him, that he had loved her and trusted her, and that he did not understand why she wanted him dead. The tape ended abruptly, and there were no more after that. I pulled out my laptop and searched for information about the previous owner. His name was Leroy, and according to public records, he had died in the house in November 1992. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, natural causes. His widow had stayed in the house for years after his death, only selling it recently after she decided to move closer to family. I searched for any news articles or police reports about Leroy's death, but there was nothing. No investigation, no suspicion of foul play, just a man who had died suddenly at the age of 56. I called the police and told them about the tapes. They sent an officer to listen to a few of them, and he took notes, but he told me there was not much they could do. Leroy's death had been ruled natural causes over 30 years ago, and without new evidence, they could not reopen the case. He said the tapes could be evidence of paranoia or mental illness, that people experiencing certain medical conditions sometimes develop irrational fears. He said that even if Leroy had believed he was being poisoned, that did not mean it was true. The officer took copies of the tapes for their records, but he made it clear that nothing would come of it. I tried to let it go, but I could not stop thinking about the tapes. I tracked down Leroy's widow, a woman named Hazel, and I found out that she had died 2 years ago. But here is the part that has haunted me ever since. Hazel died in the same house where Leroy died, the house I now own. After living with her daughter for several years, she had moved back, repurchasing the property and living there alone until her death. The records showed she had died of heart failure, the same cause listed on Leroy's death certificate. I do not know what to make of that. I do not know if it means anything or if it is just a horrible coincidence. But the thought of 2 people dying in this house, both of heart failure, both after one of them had accused the other of poisoning, it feels like too much to ignore. I started thinking about Frances, about how she had died so suddenly. She had been complaining of headaches, and then she was gone. The doctors said it was an aneurysm, that it was unpreventable, but what if they were wrong? What if there was something else, something they did not test for? I know how that sounds. I know I am starting to think like Leroy, seeing patterns where there might not be any, suspecting things that make no sense. But I cannot help it. Frances was healthy until those last few weeks, and then everything fell apart so quickly. I keep replaying those final days in my mind, looking for signs I might have missed, wondering if there was something I should have noticed. The tapes have made me question everything, and I hate that. I hate that I am doubting the woman I loved, the woman I spent most of my life with. I reported the tapes to the police, and they told me the case was too old to investigate meaningfully. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and both Leroy and Hazel are dead. There is no one to charge, no way to prove anything one way or another. I still live in this house, but it does not feel like home. It feels like a place where terrible things happened, where two people may have been murdered, and where no one will ever know the truth. I think about Leroy often, about how he spent his final months in fear, convinced that the person he trusted most was trying to kill him. I think about whether he was right, and whether his death was dismissed too easily. And I think about Frances, about whether I will ever be able to remember her without this shadow of doubt. The tapes have taken that from me, and I do not know if I will ever get it back. I live in a house that may have witnessed 2 murders, and I carry the weight of suspicions that I can never prove. And every day I wonder if the truth died with Leroy, or if it is still here waiting in the walls, recorded on tapes that no one will ever fully believe. I rented a small house near campus because it was cheap and allowed pets. I should have asked why it was so cheap. I should have asked why the previous tenant left mid-lease. I should have asked a lot of questions, but I was a graduate student on a tight budget, and the rent was half of what other places were charging. I signed the lease, moved in with my cat Hazel, and thought I had found the perfect situation. I was wrong. The house was a small 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street, about a 10-minute walk from the university. It was older, probably built in the 1950s, but it was clean, and the landlord seemed eager to rent it. He gave me the keys, told me to call if I had any problems, and that was it. I moved in on a Saturday in late August, setting up my bedroom and my study space, and everything seemed fine. Hazel adjusted quickly, exploring every corner of the house and claiming the sunny spot by the living room window as her territory. The first week passed without incident. I settled into my routine, attending classes during the day and working on my thesis at night. Hazel was her usual self, lounging around the house and demanding attention when it suited her. But then, exactly 1 week after I moved in, something changed. It was a Tuesday night, and I was sitting on the couch reading when Hazel suddenly sat up and stared at the corner of the living room. Her ears were flat against her head, and her tail had puffed up to twice its normal size. She was staring at the corner near the window, the empty corner where nothing was happening. I looked over at the corner, expecting to see a bug or a shadow, but there was nothing there. Hazel continued to stare, completely fixated, and then she backed away slowly and left the room. She would not come back into the living room for the rest of the night, which was unusual because that was where she normally spent her evenings. I checked the corner, looked behind the furniture, and found nothing that could have spooked her. I assumed she had seen something I could not, the way cats sometimes do, and I did not think much of it. The next night, at exactly 9:15, the temperature in the living room dropped. I was sitting at my desk in the adjacent study when I felt the cold air spill into the room, and I got up to investigate. The living room felt like a freezer, cold enough that I could see my breath. I checked the windows, thinking one had been left open, but they were all closed and locked. I checked the thermostat, but the heat was on and functioning normally. The rest of the house was warm, but the living room was ice cold. The temperature stayed like that for about 20 minutes, and then, just as suddenly as it had dropped, it returned to normal. I stood there with a thermometer, watching the numbers climb back up, and I could not explain what had just happened. Hazel refused to enter the living room during the cold spell, hiding under my bed until it was over. I checked the vents, the insulation, everything I could think of, but I found no explanation. The same thing happened the next night at 9:15. The temperature dropped. The living room became freezing cold and Hazel hid. I timed it this time, and the cold lasted exactly 23 minutes before the temperature returned to normal. I started documenting it, taking temperature readings and recording the exact times. It happened every single night at 9:15 without fail. The temperature would drop by 15 to 20 degrees, last for 23 minutes, and then return to normal. There was no pattern to the weather outside, no correlation to whether I was using the heat or not, nothing that explained it. I called the landlord and told him about the temperature issue. He sounded annoyed, like I was making a big deal out of nothing, but he sent a maintenance person to check the heating and cooling system. The technician spent 2 hours inspecting everything, testing the vents and the thermostat and the ductwork, and he found nothing wrong. He said the system was functioning perfectly and that there was no reason for one room to drop in temperature like that. He suggested I was imagining it, and when I showed him the thermometer readings, he just shrugged and said maybe I had a draft I had not noticed. But it kept happening. Every night at 9:15, the living room became freezing cold, and it lasted exactly 23 minutes. I started spending my evenings in other parts of the house, avoiding the living room during that time, but I could still feel the cold radiating from the room. Hazel would start acting anxious around 9 o'clock every night, pacing and meowing, and she would not settle down until the cold spell was over. After 2 weeks of this, I started researching the house. I contacted previous tenants through a local renters group, and I found 3 people who had lived there before me. All of them mentioned the cold. One of them said she had lasted 6 weeks before breaking her lease. Another said he had tried to document it and report it to the landlord, but nothing had been done. The third person said she had gotten used to it, but that it eventually drove her cat insane, and she had to move out for the sake of her pet. I asked them if anyone had figured out what was causing it, and they all said no. One of them had hired a paranormal investigator who had come to the house with equipment and had documented the temperature drop, but had no explanation for it. Another had contacted the gas company and the electric company, thinking it might be related to the utilities, but both companies had inspected the house and found nothing unusual. The phenomenon was real, documented by multiple people, but no one had been able to explain it. Then about 3 weeks after I moved in, the cold spot started moving. Instead of staying in the living room, it began to travel through the house. It still started at 9:15 every night, but now it would appear in the living room for a few minutes, then move to the hallway, then to the kitchen, following a specific path. I mapped it out, tracking where the cold spot went each night, and I realized it was moving in a straight line through the house. The path always ended at the closet in the second bedroom, the room I was using for storage. I set up thermometers along the path, documenting the exact progression of the cold. It moved slowly, about 1 foot per minute, and it followed the same route every single night. When it reached the closet, it would linger there for about 5 minutes, and then it would dissipate. I opened the closet and searched it thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain the phenomenon. There was nothing inside except some boxes I had stored there, and the closet itself was just a standard built-in. Nothing unusual about the construction. I decided to investigate further. I pulled up the carpet in the closet and found a concrete slab underneath, solid and unremarkable. But something made me keep going. I contacted the landlord and got permission to inspect the flooring, and I hired someone to bring a ground-penetrating radar unit to scan beneath the closet. The scan showed nothing. No voids, no pipes, no structural anomalies. Just solid concrete and earth beneath it. But here is what happened next. The night after I scanned the closet floor, the cold spot stopped. It did not appear at 9:15, and it did not appear the next night or the night after that. For an entire week, the house was normal. The temperature stayed consistent. Hazel calmed down. And I thought maybe the phenomenon had finally ended. But then, exactly 1 week later, it started again. Only this time, instead of starting at 9:15 in the evening, it started at 9:15 in the morning. The cold spot followed the same path, moving through the house and ending at the closet, but now it happened during the day instead of at night. I documented it, timed it, and confirmed that it was the same phenomenon, just shifted by 12 hours. I could not understand why it had changed or what it meant. I contacted the previous tenants again, and none of them had experienced the time shift. For them, it had always been at night. I could not live with it anymore. The unpredictability, the constant cold, the way Hazel was becoming more and more anxious, it was too much. I broke my lease and moved out after 4 months, paying the penalty and losing my security deposit. The landlord was not surprised. He admitted that no tenant had stayed in that house for longer than 6 months in the past 5 years, and that he had given up trying to figure out what was wrong with it. He said he had hired engineers, inspectors, and even a priest, but nothing had worked. The phenomenon continued, and it showed no signs of stopping. I moved into an apartment building with concrete walls and dozens of other tenants, and I have not experienced anything unusual since. But I still think about that house, about the cold spot that moved through it every day at 9:15. I researched the property history extensively, looking for deaths, tragedies, anything that might explain it. And I found nothing. The house had no dark past, no recorded incidents, nothing that would suggest a haunting or a curse. It was just a house with an unexplained phenomenon that no one could fix and no one could understand. I have accepted that I will never know what caused it, and that bothers me more than anything. I am a graduate student, someone who is trained to find answers and solve problems, and this is a problem that has no solution. The cold spot exists, it has been documented by multiple people, and it defies every rational explanation. And somewhere in that house right now at 9:15 in the morning, the temperature is dropping in the living room and no one knows why.